back, everyone. We're going to start now our third panel of the day, and I'll pass it on to Sam to introduce them.
Thanks so much, Christina, and thanks everyone for coming back after lunch. So the topic of this next panel session, it's actually split into two. So the first part of it is going to be on sustainable agriculture and nature-based solutions, and then we're going to move seamlessly into part two, which is about climate resilience and health. To briefly introduce the topics before handing over to the moderator, Larry. So around a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, and experts tell us that around a third of the climate mitigation we need to achieve the Paris Agreement goals can come from nature-based solutions. So although this often gets less attention than the energy sector, there's actually significant potential for agriculture and land to play a role in meeting our climate goals. It can be very challenging, although there are technologies already out there and techniques to reduce emissions from agriculture. They can be difficult to roll out. It can be hard to get the incentives in place. So I'm sure we'll have a good discussion about how we can encourage and enable farmers to adopt some of these practices and potentially benefit as well from some of the revenue streams that can come from sequestering carbon on their land and complementing food production. The second part is around climate resilience and health. Even though, depending on how we do in terms of reducing emissions over the next decade, because of the greenhouse gas emissions already in the atmosphere, a certain amount of global warming is locked in, and we're going to see increases in extreme weather events and other climate impacts. And so it's essential that responsible governments take steps to make the economy more resilient, to invest in additional measures to protect people from those extreme weather events, protect people's health and livelihoods. And it's obviously not about giving up on mitigation, but it's about making sure that we're prepared for the impacts of climate change that are going to come as a result of what's already there. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to the moderator, Larry Anthony, who's a former president of the Nationals and a board member at Coalition for Conservation.
Thank you very much. Well, look, all of you, I imagine, probably would have met some of our panel members, but just in case you haven't, we might just do a quick roll call. So at the end is David Speirs, and David is the leader of the opposition now in South Australia. A very big task he has to do. David was elected into the South Australian Parliament in 2014. Prior to then, he'd been involved in local government. I had the pleasure of knowing David probably 10 years ago, where we served on the board of the Duke of Edinburgh. So he had a very strong commitment to youth and building resilience and capacity in young Australians. In 2017, David became the Minister for the Environment under the Marshall government, and was responsible for a lot of significant policy reform there. And over lunch we were just discovering with our second speaker, Adrian Turner, where I think they might have got to meet each other on, as I've discovered now, KI, which for those that don't know is Kangaroo Island. And that was really in the middle of the substantial fires that when Australia was on fire 2 years ago. David works for the Minderoo Foundation, and that's, as some of you should know, but it sort of was formed out of Fortescue Metals. And he heads up just to double check, the disaster preparedness and resilience section of Minderoo. But prior to then, he's had a very long career really in technology. He was in Silicon Valley for 18 years. I don't think technology took him there initially. I think love did. But obviously technology came second, and was involved in a number of enterprises there until he was recruited back to by one of the former governments to be the CEO at Speirs for Data 61, and that's involved in a lot of the AI roadmaps on data collection, on open banking, on data rights, genomics, all sorts of stuff, as well as having his own cybersecurity company. Beside him is David Jochinke, or I call him DJ, as we're affectionately meant to call him. And he's our farmer on the panel today, and from near a place called Murrawarra, which is near Horsham in rural Victoria. And I understand you've got broadacre farming, fat lambs, and also into renewables, where there's at least 6 turbines on your property, and part of a larger grouping of properties where up to 100 turbines in this particular area. So in many ways, you're actually living it day to day, the compatibility between ag and a cleaner environment. And of course, on my left is the Minister for the Environment and Heritage. So David Griffin's James took on that role.
Yes,
too many Davids took on
yeah.
that role in 2021 with the Paratate government taking over from the former Premier, and was elected through the constituency of Manly in 2017, and prior to then had a long career with KPMG in a whole range of areas. And I know, again, discovered over lunch, is very driven and passionate about how we can, probably more on the second part of the discussion, of how we can get more private sector involvement, particularly in land conservation, to find some of those offsets that we've been talking about today. So maybe to kick it off, I read an article, would have been about 2 months ago, and it was by Professor Blaney, who many of you might know. And he was writing about the future of Australian agriculture in the context of what was happening with the Ukraine war. And other speakers referred to the huge food shortages now that have suddenly bestowed the world because of the denial of 1/3 of the world's wheat, of maize, of corn and other products that come out from that are coming out from the Ukraine. And he was saying that Australia really, well, we've got a responsibility now to step up and produce more food, particularly in those soft commodities, to those nations that can be deprived. And again, mentioned by other speakers, which countries like Egypt, Indonesia, Turkey, Nigeria, and even countries into India and China. And I know one of the ambitions of the previous government was to try to get Australian agriculture to $100 million worth of exports, which is ambitious. But to do that is going to be challenging, particularly when we've got to try to get to this net zero environment. So perhaps with yourself, if we can go down to Horsham. And I mean, you're a living example of living with agriculture, living with renewables. You're also Vice President of the National Farmers Federation, and they've been pretty proactive, I think, in this whole climate debate, which is probably different to even some elements of the political party that I belong to. But in some ways, I mean, you're living it, you have to, because you're custodians of the land. So I'd love to hear your experiences.
So probably just a little bit more, just a bit loud. I'm a third generation farmer. Dad was a farmer, I'm a farmer. My mum was a primary school teacher, my sister's a primary school teacher. So we're not really super original in that sense, Larry. But what we have been able to do in our area is adopt a lot of technologies to make us more efficient. So if Grandpa was around nowadays, he'd be spinning his burrow, because the amount of technology that we do adopt to, first of all, reduce workforce for us has been a key driver in Australian agriculture. The cost of labour is astounding compared to other regions. And I have had the pleasure to visit and travel through Ukraine and a lot of areas through various scholarships and see their production systems compared to ours. But one of the things that strikes me whenever we talk about agriculture and management of land, or the stewardship of land, is that management techniques can be easily copied. One of the biggest constraints is capital and actually getting access to buying technology and actually adopting it. So whatever we're doing today in the management sense can be easily adopted elsewhere. We are seeing that through different practices or production systems, where we are making better choices of using water, because we're rain-fed. In Australia, we're a dry country, so there's not too many areas where we've got water to burn. And even then, we talk about the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which is the big issue for a lot of producers. And when it's raining, it's fine. And when it's scarce, it is the biggest issue that affects those communities and the livelihood of those farmers, let alone then the ability to keep schools open and that regionality piece, of which I think we'll touch on a bit later. But everything's a compromise in agriculture. When we choose a system, if we choose not to cultivate our ground and we store our carbon, we then rely on technologies such as glyphosate. So if consequences of decisions overseas and us following similar policies that take tools out of the shed for us to manage weeds, and we have to go back to tillage, It actually undoes all the good work that we've actually done with regards to soil cover, carbon retention, how we manage our stubble loading. And the last thing we want to do is not be a part of the solution. And by allowing those technologies to unlock those capacities for agriculture to play a part of that, not only the $100 billion, so we are more efficient to produce the food at a better price, noting too that globally, we talk about Ukraine, but we also have massive droughts in North and South America that also cause food shortages and supply chain issues. It's just more acute because we can't ship stuff. And when we talk about Russia, the fertiliser that comes out of there is the backbone of our potash that we don't have in Australia readily. And so some of those limiting factors too also will put a cap on our capacity and capabilities moving forward. But I guess the key thing for us at National Farm is when we talk about sustainability, it's that everything needs to have its place. It's all place-based. You can't pick up my farming system and drop it in the Northern Territory and vice versa from east to west. So when we talk about, as a collective, what we want to achieve, that's fine in the principles, but the actual practical side of how we go about it comes down to the capacities and the natural resources that we have, the ability for those farmers to either have a successive run of years to adopt the latest technology, because the stuff that's coming out is awesome. But when you're talking about harvesting equipment that's worth over $1 million a throw, if you can get it, you can order it today and they say, that's great, I'm glad you picked the colour, but you won't see it for 12 months and we'll tell you the price when it rocks up. That is a hard management decision. And so we've gone from a lifestyle where Old MacDonald is a song that you learn at school to now where we are making millions, literally dollars of decisions up front. We have to wait anywhere up to 8 months to see if we've made the right decision or not. It is a tough business, and I underline the word business, and if anything else, especially when we went through the noughties, all those droughts and the hard times, we've come out the back end more galvanised and more focused on how can we maximise both the resources we have, but then also how we manage ourselves as businesses as a totality.
I think, and maybe I'll just bring in our politicians here, when we talk about sustainable agriculture, so if you're in the regions or if you're a farmer, I think you get that. If you're in a built-up urban environment like the constituencies that perhaps you represent, James, in Manly, or yourself, David, there's often I think it's less now, but a disconnect between urban Australia and between rural Australia. And for instance, I just wonder whether we're actually going to be finding a shift back to, let's say, more conventional agriculture. When you think about what's happened in Sri Lanka recently. So in Sri Lanka, they made a decision, or the former president, to go all organic. And so that was the mantra to no more fertilisers. Their perception was a very clean, green environment. And what happened? There's actually been absolute devastation because the rice crops haven't been grown. There's social instability because there's not enough food. And actually now they're reverting back to traditional agriculture. And I think, like organics was always seen as and I know from my area in Byron Bay, it's pretty popular. People are prepared to pay 3 times the price. I suppose if you can afford it, but in some ways it does send a signal that for sustainable agriculture, particularly as the world's population grows, we're going to have probably more modified crops, maybe they're genetically modified, to ensure that we can get this capacity. But how do we have that argument in urban Australia? So how do you have that argument in Manly, James?
Well, I think no matter where you go in Australia, there's an affinity for farmers and an affinity for regional New South Wales, and maybe even the closer you get to the coast, the more that grows because of a romanticism of what it's like, and a deep sense of gratitude for our farmers. So there's that, and then I think there's a role here for the market, and we see it increasingly. Now, how the food shortage issue will impact this remains to be seen, but to your point, Larry, there is a price point and I think a market driving sustainable farming, whether that's in, and I see it at the butcher in Fairlight in Manly. They make a huge show of having sustainable regenerative farming techniques and saying, this is lamb or this is beef that's from a particular style of farm or farming. But at the end of the day, I think there is and we saw this with the teal movement here, not far from here, and I want to acknowledge Trent in the room, as difficult as it was. And it I think, has been driven by an increased awareness or perceived awareness of what people want to see when it comes to farming practices. Now, whether they in urban areas understand and appreciate what that actually means, I don't know if it's there yet. But at the end of the day, there are three headline things that drive this for me. One is, as articulated by David, 50% of global GDP is dependent directly or indirectly upon nature. That's something that we can't escape. Second to that is 70% of Australia is owned in private hands. So it's owned by private landowners, whether they be small mum and pop farms or big, larger agri businesses. That is another thing we can't escape. And third, the top 5 risks facing us as a humanity in the next 10 years, the third is biodiversity loss. And what that speaks to is land management and the management of our oceans. So there's something that needs to be done, and gone are the days of regulation. It is about incentivising and supporting farmers and farming communities to receive the capital or get the support that they need to do better farming practices, and equally bridging the role between better use of non-productive land and conservation opportunities. Setting aside carbon offsets, there is a burgeoning, I think, next chapter in the discussion around net zero and climate change, which relates to biodiversity and conservation. And that's certainly something that we're really focused on here in New South Wales, is unlocking those potentials and those opportunities and the capital market that's there to support farmers in making better use of their land, but equally having some conservation and biodiversity offset opportunities that come with that. So it's a really interesting space, and a lot of it is being driven by the consumer.
David?
Yeah, a couple of points, Larry, and thank you for having me today. And I'm from southern Scotland. For whoever immediately wonder where in the world is his accent from, I always clear that up when I open my mouth in a new audience. Otherwise, people spend the rest of the time I'm speaking trying to guess where I'm from. And I moved here 19 and a half years ago. It's a great privilege to be the opposition leader in South Australia. For 4 years, I was the Environment Minister in a government that lasted for 4 years. And one of the arguments we took on in South Australia was around genetically modified crops. We felt there was a great hypocrisy on the left of politics and the left ideology in this country around talking a lot about the need to respond to climate change, but avoiding or not wanting to talk about the opportunities from genetically modified crops at all. And we had a moratorium on the use of genetically modified crops in South Australia until about 2019, when we ended that moratorium to create opportunities for some of our farmers to expand their yields. We do have the opportunity here in Australia to be a food bowl for the world. We already, unlike many places, we do produce far more food than we actually need here. Sometimes the media would tell us there could be challenges with food security here. Well, that's not something we're facing anytime soon. We have got a great opportunity, responsibility perhaps, to feed the world, and a great economic opportunity as well, given what's happening in Ukraine and that region. And we also know the higher yields that you can get from a particular area of land, acre, hectare, however you're going to measure it, the less land that is needed to produce the crops, the more that can be set aside for nature, for biodiversity, but also the likelihood is the less energy will be required to produce and sustain and provide resilience to those crops as well. So the silence of the left from an ideological point of view is, I think, a real hypocrisy which needs to be called out, because the opportunity and they also have a silence or an adversity to nuclear opportunities as well. And I do think we have to in the more conservative side of politics call out these hypocrisies from time to time, because the opportunity there is immense, and Australia is on the cusp of at least grabbing hold of those opportunities, if not really benefiting from them economically, but fulfilling a responsibility further afield. We also are blessed with space in Australia, and if you look at our rangelands, as they're called in some states, in South Australia we call it the pastoral lands, in the northern parts of our state, the opportunity to unlock carbon sequestration opportunities in those parts of our country are really immense. In South Australia, our Pastoral Act, I think it's called the Pastoral Land Management and Conservation Act, is so conservative it only allows pastoral activity. So, and that really only means the grazing of cattle in a Crown law definitional sense. So we actually need to look at legislative instruments there to unlock some of these areas, because carbon sequestration under our Pastoral Land Management and Conservation Act is potentially illegal if it were to be challenged. Other states may be in the same boat. Tourism activities on that land is also potentially illegal. Conservation activities, locking up some of our pastoral lands for pure conservation activities, likely would also not be allowed if challenged in the courts. So we were trying to go through a process, and I suspect the new government will take a slightly different approach, but will still pursue this to create opportunities for sequestration in our pastoral land, our rangelands, which is 40% of South Australia. South Australia is 5 times larger than the UK. So if you take 40% of that, that's a lot of carbon sequestration and land use opportunity there. Just to touch on something that James mentioned on biodiversity, I know, and David Attenborough emphasises this in his more recent commentary, that beyond the challenges of climate change, an even more pressing challenge is biodiversity decline and collapse in some parts of our planet. And getting ahead of this is key. There are a lot of financial incentives in growing numbers built into legislation pursued by governments across the nation, across the globe, on climate change initiatives, both adaptation and mitigation. There's not many at all in this part of the world around biodiversity. The European Union and the UK have been at the forefront of these things for about a generation now, and that's having really significant biodiversity benefits. Australia is not in that space in the way it should be, and we need to get there.
I should also acknowledge, we've got Mia Davies here. She's the leader of the opposition in Western Australia, and from a rural background. So, and also a former water minister here in Melinda Davies, and another former agricultural minister over here with Adam. So, if you guys want to chip in, but you're certainly very welcome. And a former member who looked after a lot of water down there in the Murray, which is. And James will do the job now. So, Minderoo, so you were explaining to me today, Adrian, that there's sort of 11 arms, and I know we'll get to the disaster preparedness and resilience probably in the second part of this discussion, but obviously there's a very large land holding within Minderoo as far as private holdings, and he's got a very strong commitment, of course, moving towards net zero. But in the dealings that you've seen, perhaps within Minderoo, within Andrew Forrest, and making it more sustainable, are you connected into that area? And so, from a data analytics point of view, and that's been your background, is as others said, if you can't measure it, you can't monitor it. How can we do things better?
So, the thing that's top of mind for me, and I have had a fair bit to do with Harvest Road on this topic, is there's an intersect between climate and climate as a disease vector as well. And I spent a lot of my career in cybersecurity, which is basically systemic risk. And I think that there's an opportunity and perhaps a conversation we should be having more proactively around biosecurity. So if we look most recently, we had warmer weather conditions blowing mosquitoes further south. We had pooled water. We had a zoonotic disease in encephalitis that was being transferred from pigs to humans First time we'd really seen it as far south. We also have African swine fever sitting in Timor. We have foot and mouth disease in region, and we have lumpy skin. So there is an opportunity to use technology in the way that we do with cybersecurity for things like threat intelligence sharing, for quarantining, for zoning, so that we can respond faster and we can actually keep the industry operational in the case of an incursion. And if you look at the macro trends, we've got 600 million people just in the region moving into the middle class that are going to demand more ag and food products. COVID notwithstanding, we've got more trade, international trade. So the potential for disease to undo the good work that we're doing in a lot of these other areas exist. And the opportunity exists to layer in new surveillance and response, and even using things like artificial intelligence to predict and get ahead of the threat in a low-cost way that doesn't introduce, burden to the sector, which is a business and has to remain profitable. So that's an area that I'm very, very focused on and spending some time with Harvest Road around.
One of the issues that was discussed today was methane. And when we look at the breakdown of where this is being produced, agriculture is a big sector. I know last year I was up at Rockhampton for Beef Week, right, which is sort of like, this is the home of Mecca where you go if you're in the beef industry. And again at a conference last week in Melbourne, which was a global food forum, and big companies like JBS that are major protein producers across the world. And it's talked about, but perhaps not to the same degree. So what are we going to do? Maybe you can start with this, David, is where we have a very large cattle herd. Is there a point where the feedstock or whatever the diet that we're going to have to do supplements to start to reduce, let's say, burping, right? I mean, as silly as it sounds, or is this just in the too hard basket? Or is there an opportunity in Australia where we're going to be creating seaweed farms and blending it with the feedstock in our grain storages or for our cattle?
I'd probably start by once again reiterating that every time you make a decision in agriculture, it's a compromise. So everyone likes the view of the cattle and the sheep in the rolling green hills, and that's great. But if you want to get maximum efficiency for the amount of units that you let the animal burp, essentially, the microbes within the ruminant, that's how it breaks down the cellulite. If you want that to work as quick as possible, the most efficient way to do that is in a feedlot. Now, that's counterproductive to everyone wanting to see the animals in a nice rolling green hill. And yes, there are technologies, and you're changing the gut microflora when you talk about how those bugs will both break down that cellulite and then how it expels it out of the animal. That's a massive change to how we use the animal. And like when we talk feedlots, the biggest one behind us here, like if you want to get back to nature, you live in a city. So I find that always an interesting conversation when I go down and visit my sister in Melbourne. They have, and quite rightly so, expectations. And a lot of the things we talk about, you've got to remember, we're the 1%ers. Out of all the population, we are at the top of the tree. We have things called first world problems, which is great because we can do something about it, we've got capacity to do it. And we should be doing it. And once again, as I said earlier, we can transfer knowledge, we can transfer management. That's what our responsibility. If we come up with that solution, Larry, if we get that, we should be passing that on to the people who don't have that capacity. Because they're as much of the solution as what we are. And they're probably needing it more than what we do. Because we get concerned when we can't get lettuce instead of cabbage in our hamburger that we haven't had to cook anyway, that 18-year-olds cook for us. And that's our biggest problem. The biggest problem is, what are we going to use to wipe our backsides with? We never ran out of protein or carbohydrates, and we won't. It's just, you didn't get the choice you had. And, boo-hoo, you didn't get your cutlet this week. But the reality is, we have got both the responsibility to be leading research, and we do. We've got some really good institutions, both state and federally, to help drive this technology. We've got to have the vision, though, to say what are we trying to achieve and then back that in. And as you know, research is a bottomless pit. You know, every research paper is, this is pretty cool, but we've got to do more research. So just take that as that's just a journey, not a destination. But when we do have those wins, and we do have those the ability to share information, share technology, that's up to us because we are at the front of the pack. And so we talk about lumpy skin, we talk about those threats that are right on our doorstep. They're developing nations and they have every right to be able to do whatever system they want to try to meet their sustainability needs. And we talk about Sri Lanka, you just got to look at Cuba. When they got cut free, their agricultural system, which was humming, like they seriously have a really great soil, really great environment, but when you take that input away from them, or you take that policy lever that takes the rug basically underneath those producers' feet, that's the idealism gone mad. So we've got to be really clear about what we're trying to achieve and have that conversation, not only about what's good for biodiversity in the nation, and biodiversity is something that we fully support, by the way, and in Australia, every area that we have that's pristine needs to be protected, but I'm doing it as a social good for everyone else. I think I should get rewarded for that. How that mechanism occurs, I'm not really sure, but if you're asking any other business to take, and we talk about UK, 5% out of their business, which is fine, they get paid for that. They get paid for the meandering tracks and the bumblebee flower fields, which is all fine, and that's this beautiful area, and love walking around through it. But that comes at a risk, and that also counters the biosecurity risk. You've got massive amount of people crawling over your property, and I've got no control over that, but it's great to have the environment. So there's always this compromise. So when we understand that when we do make those decisions, there's a compromise, how do we compensate for that compromise? But then also, what's the vision? What are we trying to achieve out of this? And is there a more eloquent way to doing it? So for me, absolutely front of mind when we do make decisions on our property, especially of how do we integrate the best technology. But if I don't have that as an option to me, if that's taken off the table, I'm going to revert back to whatever makes me money. Because heck, I've had twice in my life I have had zero income, absolutely zero. Put everything up front, and our place is larger than the average at home. We've been quite fortunate. But who pays for that? I do. I've got to come up with the money. There's no cavalry coming over the hill, so I've got to work out as a small business, as a medium-sized business, like the milk do, no different to any other business behind us. I've got to do what's best for me, and then on top of that, I've got to also think socially as well. So I think that as agriculture, we need to acknowledge that, or as the sector for agriculture and the environment, we look after over 50% of Australia's landmass. Surely we should get some recognition for that biodiversity good and also encourage it. And I agree with the legislation comment. It's about incentivising, and how can we, and it's not all just money as well. There are other things that we value above and beyond just that financial reward. So once again, understand what we're trying to achieve and then make sure that we're focused on it for a longer term, not just one cycle of government, not just one media release or one bloody cutting a ribbon, because that does nothing for me. To be honest, I don't get paid to do anything that we do other than host the wind farm. And that's a whole another social issue on top of our community of what that's caused. So it's not all beer and skittles in that department either.
Well, we might come back to that a bit later, but maybe back to yourself, James, where you talked in your opening comments. I gather what you've been doing since you've had this portfolio of environment and heritage is trying to establish frameworks when it comes to biodiversity and offsets, and how do we get the private sector more involved. Now, I know in the past, and one of the things as a politician, there was always a great deal of trepidation, particularly when state governments decided to open up more national parks, and so whilst it was a noble gesture and was meant to improve biodiversity and flora and fauna, for some in those communities, particularly when they stopped putting fire breaks through there, it was not necessarily a happy scenario. And I think what you've done is that rather than perhaps going down that path is saying, well, what sort of deal can we do with the private sector? How do we engage with landholders so they can quarantine off part of their property? They have a sense of ownership, they feel good about it, and they perhaps get compensated for it. So perhaps share to the audience what you're doing here in New South Wales.
Yeah, well, there are really, in simple terms, three elements to it. I mean, the national park is at the apex of the conservation pyramid. And there are certain areas around the state where it makes great sense to have one, to expand it, to grow it, to continue delivering on that. And as a government, and I can't take credit for that because it was prior to my time, but the previous minister did a great job in aggressively expanding the national park estate, and that work will continue. The second element or thread of work is working with the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, which is a hybrid that seeks to engage philanthropic or private sector support to work hand in hand with landowners. And one of the observations of that work over the past couple of years has been how relationship-based it is and how trust-based it is with people right across the expanse of New South Wales. Going out there, knocking on farm doors and essentially saying, look, there's a zone, a riparian zone here, a wetland, a corridor, where if we linked it up, it would help contribute to the reserve system that we've got in the state. Originally, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of apprehension in terms of signing up to those engagements because it was an element of unknown. Landowners were unsure about putting a covenant on their property. They didn't want to enter anything into perpetuity. There was a lot of unknowns around, well, why would I do this? It's a social good, sure, but what financial incentive will I receive for it? Over time, we've created a framework to provide an annualised or an in perpetuity financial payment to that landholder for them to either conserve that land, fence it off, revegetate it, rewild it, support the growth of it. And that has worked exceptionally well. Most recently, we opened that up further to corporate partners because, and across town, there's the FinReview ESG conference going on right now, where you've got the ASX 300 hunting out responsible environmental, social and governance initiatives. And the state can play a role in brokering that by finding landholders who may not want to farm their land anymore or have non-productive land, but it has a conservation value. So Telstra were our first corporate partner. We launched with them. They purchased some land in perpetuity and are now using that to offset some of their biodiversity and carbon offset responsibilities. I guess the third element, and a really important one to David's point, is the poor cousin to the climate change debate has been the biodiversity one and the conservation one, and that is about to change. COP15 in August, September, which will ultimately determine what conservation needs to, what goals and conservation work needs to happen around the world. And there is with that, a capital flow, the likes of which conservation and biodiversity will not have seen before. And that will assist in unlocking the opportunity for farmers to be appropriately financially rewarded for conservation work. How that's done and the mechanics of that are still to be settled, but what is known is that recognition that has been long overdue, that's both driven by virtue of the fact that farmers and ag account for about 70% of the country. So in order to solve this challenge, we need to work with landholders and the ag community. And second, that conservation and biodiversity is under such significant pressure, not necessarily because of farming, but there is a role here for them to be remunerated for doing good conservation work that they previously would have just been expected to do, or it would have been levied on them through regulation. And that hasn't worked, and it shouldn't be the way. So there are three, grow the national park estate, the reserve system through the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, and third is working with farmers and landholders.
Thanks, James. So, David, if I'm down there on the Eyre Peninsula or sitting up in the back of the Adelaide Hills, am I going to want to carve up some of my farm to put it in these biodiversity areas? Is there acceptance now? Are you doing that in South Australia? Because I think this is still playing out in rural Australia, in a lot of communities, and how to get that buy-in, whether they choose to do it or not.
I don't think there is widespread acceptance yet, certainly not in South Australia, and probably feel comfortable enough speaking for most of the nation in that that point of view, because South Australia does tend to be a little bit more progressive when it comes to these things and has one foot ahead, but I don't think we are quite there yet. And David made a good point in that it is always a compromise, and some farmers rightfully see this as a compromise around food security and reduction in capacity, which means potentially a reduction in profits as well. So you do need to, you can't just be saying to farmers, set aside your good land to do this. You do have to back them up with programs like James is alluding to. Most of our programs in South Australia, which have been in place in some form or another for about 40 years now, they were set up in the early 80s, are about setting aside land that is of low yielding, creek lines, scrub areas, areas of forest on their land and the like, and paying people they might be giving them access to grants for the fencing, the maintenance and things like that. We haven't got to a payment model yet, although in South Australia, if you do set aside your land, you do get a council rate discount on the value. So basically you don't pay council rates on the value of that land. Of course, if it is your rougher, scrubby, low yielding land, you're probably not paying a great deal of council rates on it anyway, so you may be saving a couple of $100 a year. It's not a lot. I'm very heartened by the movement that we are starting to see globally, which will see hopefully the same amount of money, if not more, put into the biodiversity side of things through grants and incentives to make this worth farmers' while and to make this not become a sacrifice, but instead become an opportunity, because that's how we can shift the dial. In the same way that serious money, and I'm talking tens of billions, have been set aside for climate solutions, we can now see a movement in that direction, hopefully led by the next COP, for biodiversity solutions as well. But we're not there yet, and community acceptance and political acceptance probably isn't there yet.
So can I just sort of shift the dial a bit here, because if I was to engage in that, or if I'm down at Horsham, as you know, looking after my property there, but the things that you can't control, of course, are, well, the direct climate, which is either drought, fire or floods. I come from the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, and one of the speakers that should have been here today was Kevin Hogan, but he's now a shadow minister and had to go to Perth. And I come from a town called Wollumbar, which is not very far from Lismore, and I know Ben's from that area as well now. And of course, there was a profound event that happened where it's on a floodplain, the levee bank around the city of Lismore, about 10 metres, 10.4 metres, whatever it is, and 12.4 metres, and the flood went to like 14.5. The whole place was just hammered, and you would have seen the vision, and then it kind of happened again within 2 weeks. Now, you know, these events have never been recorded, certainly in that part of Australia, and then the previous years we had those massive fires that have been talked about, and many of us had our own experiences there. Adrian, so in what you're doing now, and I know there's been a lot of how do we respond to these events, how do we put help in there, but you're coming back to the point of, well, how do we make these communities more resilient? Are there ways of prevention? I don't think there's any magic answer, but there's an absolute burning necessity as a nation of how do we better prepare ourselves if the inevitable just keeps on happening. So over to you.
So the first thing is, it was hearing David Cameron speak last night, and he encouraged the room to think about non-partisan issues where there could be consensus built. This has to be one of those. We've got these extreme weather events occurring, they're more frequent, they're more severe. Lifting resilience as a nation to be able to absorb and bounce back stronger from those sort of events, it's everybody wins. It shouldn't be politicised, it's a consensus topic. So the way we've gone about it, and just to give a sense of the scale, right, Black Summer fires was just in terms of the land area, and it was enormous. And in terms of just Lismore alone, In the space of weeks, if you look out the window, it was estimated a third of Sydney Harbour's water by volume flowed through. So extraordinary devastation, and I've been on the ground, was with the fires and with the floods as well. So what are we doing? We said we've got to solve this systemically. Today, Australia invests 97% of its money on response and recovery and 3% on preparation. It's unforgivable. And people will say we don't know what's going to happen next in high-risk areas. We actually do. We've built a national index down to the 100 household level across 45 dimensions of resilience, constantly refreshing. I can tell you down to 100 household levels what's going to happen in the next 6 months with a high degree of probability. Tasmania is a tinderbox. We're going to have a black summer-like event in Tasmania. I hope it's not this summer, but it's coming. So what we did was over 4 months, we met every 2 weeks with a group of 55 stakeholders, insurers, telcos, reinsurers, government, NGOs. And we took a systems view and said, how do we solve this? Where do we push? Where are the pressure points? And we said there's basically 3 things we could focus on. And we used the UN Sendai framework for resilience, which is basically the hazard, likely exposure, if you're not exposed, it matters less, and inherent vulnerability that could be environmental, economic, or social. We built 3 missions modelled on the Apollo mission because we thought if we'd be really audacious in what we're setting out to do, people will come out of the woodwork and want to be a part of it. So the fire one is we've set out by 2025 to be able to put out any dangerous fire anywhere in the country in 1 hour, which sounds completely implausible. But where it takes you to is Earth observation, satellite-based detection. And we've been working at commissioner, deputy commissioner level. In the last 4 weeks, we've hooked up with a Northern Hemisphere group, XPRIZE, Moore Foundation, Lockheed Martin, because there's dual-use technology from defence. We've just had NASA come on board and say they'll be a technical advisor. Our space agency, we're going to set up a test bed in New South Wales, a test bed in California, and over 2 years, we're going to challenge the world to come up with a sensor that can get down to 5 metre resolution, 5 to 15 minute refresh rates and less than 5% false positives. Real-time detection of fire from space. The spillover is to be able to instrument the land in all sorts of new ways. From the stratosphere, we can do facial recognition today. That's how powerful the sensors are today. The second one is landscapes, and where we landed was we need new economic models to reward somebody that's making an investment in the system that's going to benefit the whole or benefit other people. And to do that, you have to be able to instrument and measure what's being done and quantify the economic benefit. So natural capital. And we've instrumented the biggest in the world set of natural capital accounts in the Burnett-Mary region. We've just stood this up with partners, 5.5 million hectares. And it's a case study. And then the third one is communities. And we take the index that says here's where there needs to be help. We take Michael Berkowitz, who led the 100 Resilient Cities work for the Rockefeller Foundation, has developed a framework for Australia. And we're applying that, so that's the community enablement, led by locals, defined by locals, but nationally scalable, but hyper-local. And we stood up what we're calling the Australian Resilience Corps, target 125,000 Australian volunteers working in the off-season, a bit like Clean Up Australia Day, come out 1 or 2 times a year and get involved, roll up the sleeves and help lift resilience in communities. And that's going gangbusters, and corporate Australia is leaning into it. One of the insurers just committed $7 million to help promote the core. So it's this integrated program of work, but we absolutely need to shift this conversation. I know it's politically hard. You know, the Twitter cycle and the short news cycle doesn't reward long-term investments like this, but we just can't. I mean, the devastation on the ground in communities, 10 million Australians affected. And I've got friends still in the US, right? And the devastation they're feeling right now and the helplessness around firearms. One of my team was staying in a hotel yesterday. Someone was shot on the doors of the hotel. They shut it down. that desperation is the desperation that's being felt on the ground with Lismore and other places. Like, why is the political system not waking up to help?
Very good points, Adrian. So if we have this conversation in 5 years' time, you're going to be able to, I gather, it probably can be done now, that if there's a fire down at the harbour here, it'll be identified within minutes, and a signal will go out to somewhere, and hopefully there can be a response, which is probably very difficult when you're talking, thousands of kilometres from here. And that's probably okay, well, for a fire, but you certainly can't control droughts, and you can't control floods.
Yeah.
And again, returning to your point, because it's very precedent at the moment, is situations like Lismore. So, how do you make those communities more resilient? Because almost with fires, there's a listen to them. Well, it's listening to them is part of it, but also it's about how do you prevent those sort of events again?
So,
beg your pardon?
Hazard reduction. I mean,
Not with floods.
Adrian, you asked a very important question, and that was what is it going to take us politicians to listen to our communities? And yes, Larry, I take your point on floods. It's a little bit more complicated, but with fires, we lost some of the most incredible koala colonies in the Pilliga a decade or more ago when we took it out of the locals' hands and gave it to national parks. We could at any point have the River Red Gum area go up in a puff of smoke because it made Sydney feel fantastic. And yet, in my own patch, that fire was going for 2 weeks, and government agencies knew about it and wouldn't let the hazard reduction go in. And that's why communities such as the one that I'm blessed to represent are frustrated, feel removed from these conversations about climate change, because they're saying to themselves, but you're not listening to us. And yes, Larry, there's some ideas for the community. I mean, even the fact that we couldn't even measure the water at the back of Lismore as it was pouring down in unbelievable amounts was a failing of the system. Being able to measure that water as it came down was equally as important as listening to a community say, put that bloody fire out. And that's where we have those challenges. And our communities say, we've added all these national parks, but I don't want to live next to a national park. They're the worst neighbours. And James, you know that. We've had that conversation for about 11 years in a coalition government, that we know that the weeds, that the management, we actually don't know how healthy those national parks are. We're not measuring the biodiversity and what's surviving well or what's thriving in those national parks. We don't even have agencies that work with each other, like state forests and national parks, to count koalas. National parks won't use the technology that state forests have to actually count koalas, even though it's scientifically backed in process. So we've got to fix stuff in government, and I'm very inspired by what you've said today, Adrian, because you are tapping back into a regional and a local community, and they will become part of the conversation if they're respected in the process.
Can I just share one stat? This is a UN stat. Over the last 50 years, 74% of global economic loss and 45% of loss of life, last 50 years on the planet, due to extreme weather events, including drought and heat wave. And yet, it feels like we're having half the conversation when we're talking about a shift to renewable energy, which I get we have to get to the root cause of this, but and then you put a defence lens, and we've just announced a $100 billion program around things like hypersonic missiles, right, for something that may happen. With 100% certainty, these natural threats show up every year, and yet we're investing, and they touch millions of our population. And on the fuel load bit, we've just done a pilot with RFS. We've instrumented 70,000 square kilometres using software we pulled out of the US, satellite-based, and LiDAR. We can get down to single tree resolution from space to build a real-time view, which, what does that do? It says you've got finite resources, it allows you to prioritise. The other use of technology, we're pulling a piece of software. It turns out most fires are started by lightning. that can actually predict the type of lightning in storms so that you can have a better sense of where to further investigate if there's been an ignition point. That software exists today. So the other part of this is we can leap ahead in the use of technology so that we don't have to, it can be less disruptive. Implementing what we're advocating for doesn't have to be disruptive economically.
Well, I think this is a really good segue to a bit more Q&A here. So,
I've got the mic again, so I'll ask the first question. But I'm interested to know, our Indigenous rangers have done a lot of work managing fires throughout the years, and a combination of technologies and their knowledge could be quite good. Is there any interaction in that sense, and what is being done in New South Wales or in South Australia? Because I know in the Northern Territory is a few, and it's usually motivated and done by charities or environmental organizations, but I don't know how much government is involved in it.
It's a really interesting point you make, Chris, because there's a real important part for this, but you can't, what's now described as cultural burning in South Australia, one, it's not a panacea, and two, you can't retrofit it into a landscape where it was never done. So the Adelaide Plains and the Mount Lofty Ranges, where 80% of South Australians live, there's very little evidence that there would ever have been cultural burning there by traditional owners or Aboriginal people in South Australia. So you can't fake it to make it, I suppose. We know that out in the rangelands, the desert country, there would have been a lot more of that. Kangaroo Island, for instance, where Adrian and I first met in the most traumatic of circumstances in early January 2020. Aboriginal people didn't go to Kangaroo Island. It's a dark place in their stories. So to retrofit cultural burning into that landscape would just be making white people feel good, in my view, but wouldn't be real in any way. So you have to pick and choose in consultation with Aboriginal people the right landscape for that. There is a place for it, but not only if it makes you feel good and gives yourself a pat on the back, I suppose. That's my view. And I've been very cautious about that because there's too much doing it for the sake of it. For instance, we did it in Adelaide's parklands, which are kikuyu grass. Now, I'm not sure that was overly traditional.
Got a question from Nick Cade?
Yeah, I think coming from a conservative liberal perspective, I'm troubled by the idea, I'm still troubled by the idea of paying farmers to take their land out of production. I'm also troubled by the approach, I think, which has been conducted, particularly in New South Wales, probably for the last 20 years, of a clipboard type approach to biodiversity, going around and counting native grasses and finding people if they're not quite up to scratch. But I'm excited by some of the great strides that are being taken in carbon and measurement of carbon, and how by providing better ways of measuring carbon in soil, you can give farmers incentive to improve it. They've got the potential to sell that carbon, as is already happening in this country, as you'd know. Famously, Rupert Murdoch's son-in-law is selling carbon to Bill Gates from Australian farming. So how can we actually look to an idea where farming actually becomes a solution, where productive farming becomes a solution, by benefiting from all the benefits that come by improving the soil content of soil, and that includes fewer inputs, greater productivity, better products, crucially biodiversity, crucially less runoff, slowing the progress of water and avoiding some of these, particularly flash floods. How can we get into that and find a solution which I feel, in my heart, is a much more liberal approach to this, which is a bottom-up approach where you incentivise farmers to farm in a better way because of the hip pocket and because actually they're farmers and they don't want to make the land worse, they want to improve the land. Can we have a bit of a discussion around that?
Do you want to go first, David?
Oh, absolutely, Larry.
Yeah.
So totally agree with taking out productive land for the sake of trying to turn a dollar. But if you weigh it up, once again, I've got canola at $1,000 a tonne, I've got lentils at $1,000 a tonne. If I'm going to get paid for locking up that dirt, that it's got to be a very attractive number for me to. So I'm a capitalist. Which one am I going to choose? But when I come back and we have the discussion around is soil carbon the solution, it's a part of it. It's not going to be our woes, because to be honest, I might need some of that carbon myself. Because if I'm running livestock, I've got to offset my methane output. If I'm running my sheep, and we do run a fair substantial number at times, I might need that for myself. So I want to have a bank that I can flex and not necessarily sell into perpetuity. I might want to just sell it for 12 months and keep it for myself, whatever I do next. I want to have flexibility too in my system. And we talk about floods and fires, and heck, I've held a hose. I've held a hose in some pretty interesting situations, and they're only getting hotter. And I don't care if it's cultural burning or if it's just management. If you don't want to burn it, that's fine. It'll burn itself. It'll burn itself. It doesn't matter how many planes you throw at it. It is hot. It is hot. Like, we've got this little rock at home called the Grampians. When we went in there after, it was Australia Day fires, we were going up a track that was once bitumened. It was that hot, it burnt all of the asphalt. That's amazingly hot fire. Amazingly hot. So, yeah, by all means, don't manage it. It'll look after itself, and by heck, what we saw at Gippsland, people being concerned that they were getting a little bit of smoke in autumn. Well, they got a lot of smoke in autumn last year and summer, 2 years ago, sorry, purely because of a lifestyle choice. Now, once again, I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but by not making a decision, you've made a decision as far as management of those lands. But coming back to carbon, yeah, I think that agriculture's got front and centre of responsibility. I don't believe that you should be talking about productive lands. I think that, as we were talking about earlier with those more marginal is a very hard thing to measure, by the way, extremely hard thing to measure. How can you make sure that we're locking away the biodiversity within that conversation and making sure that the assistance, once again, may not be always financial, and yeah, it makes you feel good if you fence off a riparian waterway, but in a drought, we run a lot of kangaroos out of state parks and on properties that we get no credit for, and we don't have any ability to control or manage. So when we have those circumstances where we do have a natural disaster and things are doubling down on us, we don't have the tools then, because when you get a kangaroo permit, generally you can only, in Victoria anyway, you shoot 20%. 20% is nothing on your property, if they just keep coming off of the parks, because I've improved the pasture. Well, the farmers have improved the pasture, so we've got something green to eat, but in the parks they don't. They'll come onto the property and gut the place. Yeah, it's once again getting that management right, that you get the reward right, you get management right for what is potentially one of the biggest sinks, which is national parks, and have them in a healthy state. And then we have to talk about, and that's only going to be a small part, then we have to talk about systems approach, so inputs, how we can make sure that we're producing them as sustainably as possible, but not taking any options off the table. Because once again, I come back to the glyphosate discussion and talk about regen ag. Fantastic, beautiful concept, but you'll never feed the world. And when we say feed the world, Australia, look, we'll feed 75, 80, maybe, if we push it really high, 90 million people. That's where we top out. So we're not the food bowl, we're a food basket. Our product has to be put into the middle class because we can't afford to sell it below cost of production, because our cost of production is extremely high. So with that being recognised, the numbers have to stack up. Ultimately, the numbers have to stack up.
Just clarify, so we're not going off on a tangent. I'm not talking about organic. I'm not talking about doing away with traditional inputs. All I'm saying is you look at methods to increase the soil carbon. So I'm talking about what you already do, which is no-till farming. I'm talking about rotational grazing, principally when it comes to grazing. None of this is to do with organic. I think this is a bit of a red herring. I'd just like to focus on how we can turn productive farms into more, to actually bring a benefit by absorbing carbon and in the process of improving the soil.
I might go to Adrian and then we'll come back to the other speakers if that's all right.
So, actually, if you can come back to me, because I think
Okay.
what I'm going to say might take us off on a tangent, and I don't think the conversation's ready for that.
James?
Yeah, just to allay your concerns, Nick, I'm not suggesting anything to do with locking up productive land. Rather, what I'm encouraging is the latter points that you made around what can be done on farm to create a more sustainable farm, or where there is land that is not being used for productive purposes. How can that play a role in conservation and biodiversity? So just to be clear on that. And I think, let's be careful here, because you start to run out of places to go when, if on one hand, you're going to shit can national parks, I've visited 15 of them in 7 months. They are all attempting to be great neighbours. Of course, there's opportunity to do better. They play an important role because there's one public expectation that they are there and they're expanded and they're grown. But second, they do need to also carry their load when it comes to being good, appropriate neighbours to the agricultural community. But we need both of them to work together to solve this problem with respect to how we are dealing as a Conservative party and grouping of people with the challenges of nature and climate change. So we've got to be careful and aware of that. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that we evolve or dramatically upturn the agricultural industry. It is about supporting and incentivising them to be able to be playing an even bigger role, a duality role of feeding us, but at the same time in supporting the conservation goals we all share.
Thanks, James. Gentlemen?
One area that we haven't touched on, which goes to your point to an extent, is the circular economy when it comes to particularly food waste. So rough stat, 40% of all waste that goes in your landfill bin, I'll use very generic terms, I won't use colours of bin lids because that'll confuse everyone, but the landfill bin, 40% of that is food. That doesn't need to go in landfill. If it goes in landfill, it leaches a whole heap of different greenhouse gases which contribute to climate change. Between 1 and 2% of greenhouse gases come from landfill. That's small, but it's not insignificant when we want to actually deal with this problem. And I think this is one we can deal with quite easily and knock off that 1 to 2%. If we are instead capturing that through food organics and green organic processes at curbside collection, not all states are here yet. I know South Australia is very much progressed in this. New South Wales is doing a fair bit of work. The previous federal government have kicked in a bit of money here. If we can get that food waste actually into our agricultural landscape, we can store the carbon and the gases from that food waste. We can increase the yield, the productivity of the soil. We can grow more. We can increase the water retention of the soil. We can grow more, and there's a real win there in that circular system. So, some states are moving ahead more than others on this, but the federal government identified about 6 months ago this needed a real applied effort. So just one example where there are some pretty quick wins, and it's not sophisticated technology that's required, it's just systems.
Adrian?
Yeah, so where I was going to go is I guess a challenge to the group to, I know from the Data 61 experience, there are a lot of market opportunities for Australia where we actually had the leading approaches, the leading technology, we didn't capitalise, and we end up playing catch up with other parts of the world. And this intersect of, if you look at the last 20 or 30 years, the innovation has been IT driven. In a lot of cases, right? It's the digitisation of a lot of different industries, including ag, and the application of technology. If you look at the next 30 years, it's going to be really a bio-based economy, including genomics, including synthetic biology as well. So we talk about soil biome and the opportunities there to use biological processes instead of petrochemical ones. And I mean, the estimates are somewhere between $2 to $4 trillion in terms of the prize over the next 10 to 15 years for this, bio-driven economy. So I think the challenge to Australia is actually to leap ahead and capture that. And our ability to, I don't know, even you think about synthetics as an input. I think McKinsey said something like 60% of the world's economic inputs could be biological. So you think about textiles, you think about brewing spider silk-based textiles that have the tensile strength of Kevlar, right? And we're brewing that in vats. Like, as a country, they're the sort of opportunities it feels like, not at the expense of the ag sector at all, but there's expertise in understanding biological systems we can apply and leap ahead. And we have a strong med tech sector as well. You put those things together, and Australia could be both. That can be an economic driver, but it's also a driver to reduce emissions.
Any more questions? Or? So Larry, last year we visited, when we went to Glasgow and London, we went and had a big round table with Dean, and you were there with the Minister for Agriculture, and they were talking a lot about how they've changed their way of doing subsidies, because we don't have them here for farmers, but in the UK and Europe they do, and they're changing it completely, the way they do things. So I just, before you close, I just wanted for, now that you're here, Sam, to explain what's happening in the UK, despite the differences, we can't even compare their agriculture with ours, but just what they're doing now is quite interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Under the as members of the European Union, the UK used to be part of the Common Agricultural Policy. We used to get about £3 billion a year, which would be given out to farmers according to the Common Agricultural Policy. And the vast bulk of it essentially was given to farmers according to how much farmland they owned and managed. There were a few sort of small green strings attached, but essentially it was just given out to people according to how much land they owned. So it was ended to be quite regressive, so that the wealthiest farmers got the most money. It wasn't particularly good for agricultural productivity. The UK ag productivity has been quite stagnant. We've had a gradually ageing farmer population. It's inflated land prices and land rents, meaning that you haven't got that turnover of new entrants coming into the sector. And of course, it's not great for the environment either, because it's not incentivised the environmentally friendly practices. So having left the EU, it's an opportunity to reform them, and we have instead created this new system of public money for public goods as the tagline. Essentially, it's using taxpayers' money to reward farmers for good environmental stewardship, with a particular focus on the sorts of measures that also improve and enhance food security. So rewarding farmers for looking after their soils better, for example, improving the fertility of the soils, but also capturing more carbon, enabling more soil biodiversity at the same time. So we're just starting to roll this out now in the UK, and as Chris says, it's only really possible because we're leaving the EU and we've got this budget that we can now reallocate. I know Australia doesn't have farming subsidies, but globally there's $700 billion, I believe, every year that goes on farming subsidies, and I think there's a big opportunity as part of some of the international nature conversations to talk about how we can reform those subsidy regimes and hopefully deliver better outcomes, both for farming, for food security, and for the environment with that money.
Two questions, if I could. First to Adrian. When Labor was last in government, much effort was put, ultimately unsuccessfully, in changing sort of governmental structures in Australia. They desired to recognise local government in the Constitution. Lots of talk about regionalisation. How much of a hindrance to disaster mitigation in Australia is our federation and our 3 tiers of government, or, disclosure on my part, I'm a very strong federalist, or can they be worked through if we concentrate on perhaps focusing attention and giving a stronger voice to local communities as part of that disaster mitigation effort?
So I'm a big believer in bottom-up. I think every community is different, the terrain, the makeup of the community. So would always advocate for a stronger local voice. But let me give a concrete example of where the gears aren't meshing. So if you look at NRRA, the National Resilience and Recovery Agency, that mandate was to invest more in resilience. What's happening is it's not. It's investing in recovery and they're labelling it resilience, and that's happening all over the country. So we're responding to Lismore, we're recovering, we're doing some things differently, we're calling it resilience. It's not. But temporary accommodation is a great example. So that evening on KI, I stayed on the island and we did a town hall. Myself and a guy called Mark Tazewell, who leads the mining camps for Andrew and Fortescue. And we asked them, what do you need? We're here to help, what do you need? And they said, actually what we needed is a roof over our head. We don't want to leave the island. It's our home. So the next morning we're on the ferry, it's like 6:30 in the morning, and Mark goes, Adrian, I think I cracked it. And he pulls out his napkin and he goes, we can convert shipping containers into livable pods. We can put them on the back of semis and we can drop ship them into places. So we did. We partnered with South Australia Government and New South Wales, and we've manufactured 297 of those. And they're Minderoo's gift to the country. Now we have the floods, we've relocated 40 of them. But what's needed is 2,000 temporary accommodation units. And the problem we have is disrupted supply chains in the mining sector building 20% capacity for quarantining for COVID. So where the hell are we going to get these? And then you go, why don't we have a national asset register of temporary accommodation assets that can be redeployed around the country during the time of a disaster? It's such an easy thing to do. And so we had the conversation. I understand at the federal level, don't want to own assets. There's a stigma around quarantine facilities, are probably the closest to that. At the state level, we've got a great ally in Shane Fitzsimmons in New South Wales, who also believes there needs to be a national solution to this. But there's just been such tension between the feds have wanted to be more than the bank and kind of influence how money gets deployed. The states have said absolutely not. You know, we're the front line. So those gears have meshed, and what's ended up happening, we're seeing it play out now in this temporary accommodation space, is it's a mess. And again, we advocate like non-partisan, bipartisan. Why wouldn't we have a national asset register of temporary accommodation? And different, not just Minderoo's. Ours is suited to rural areas. You want to set up a football field village for people to live on for 6 months. Now, why I'm optimistic that there will be change is financial. So in the last budget, there was a $10 billion reinsurance pool announcement because big parts of Australia are uninsurable. So now government is carrying the risk of disasters on their balance sheet. So in the next couple of weeks, I'm off to see Stephen Kennedy, Treasury, and say, you're carrying this risk. It's actually an economic imperative to lift resilience to these disasters as well. Sorry? Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we all know that we live in the dry continent, and we also know that in 220 years we've made it a lot drier. We've managed to clear the land, too much land. We've managed to make the waterways move much faster, etc. But we shouldn't forget that we do have the opportunity to rehydrate Australia. And I think that's critical. If we can get the water back into Australia, it's going to make such a difference, right? More things are going to grow, we'll minimise droughts, etc. One of the things I do is I'm on the board of the Balloon Institute, and at Balloon Creek down in Bungendore near Canberra was quite interesting because when we put in weirs there, etc., all our neighbours downstream carried on about how we were stealing their water. But that all changed when we had the biggest drought in living memory, right? And what we did by putting those weirs in was to lift the water table progressively. And I've also done it with a series of chain of ponds on my property at Minderoo, and we lifted the water table by something like 1.5 metres. But Mulloon Creek was a really interesting example because we've just had the biggest flood, the biggest drought in living memory, as they say. And when that happened down there, water stopped coming into the top of Mulloon Creek. But the neighbours loved us because water was still going out at the bottom of Mulloon Creek where we had joined our neighbours. Why? Because we'd rehydrated all of the land adjacent to the creek. We can do that all over Australia. And it's such an important thing to rehydrate this country.
So why isn't it being done?
I'll tell you why. Because when the Mulloon Institute came to see myself as water minister, the department didn't want to have anything to do with it. And it was only when Rob Stokes and I pushed back and said this just makes sense, we actually reopened the door, because you were going to, well, the fellow on the farm was going to be fined for storing the water. So we do have a lot of challenges, again, with city-based decision makers not understanding how the topography actually could work better.
Okay, well, look, I think this is a good way to wind it up. I mean, that was that last question, and also, Adrian, what you were saying is that, you know, when we look forward, particularly with agriculture, which is obviously owned by not just family farmers, but by corporates, regional communities are absolutely reliant on agriculture on a sustainable basis. Governments don't have all the solutions at all. I mean, the private sector and what you're doing is so important. So departmental heads, so legislators can be provided with solutions. And I think it's a lot harder because we've heard from David Cameron today and we think, wow, isn't Britain doing great stuff? But it's a lot smaller. You're not a federated state. We've got a much bigger landmass and a dry continent. So I don't think we want to be too hard on ourselves either. So if anything comes out of this, it's just an absolute necessity with the private sector, leading edge, can help government. Government's got its own challenges in managing various stakeholders, and I think it was good that we had a bit of competitive tension in some of the arguments here today, because that's the landscape that we operate on. And I'm just really pleased that we've got really good legislators who are here assisting, and also the private sector and the not-for-profits. And hopefully we can make our farming communities more productive and those regional communities more sustainable. So thank you, gentlemen. Let's give them a round of applause.